What's up guys, it's Sunday actually right now as I'm recording this, but I've been up very early this morning because I had a long drive up to Birmingham. I'm now at the NEC for the Classic Car Show, but I'm quite excited because today I'm joining Mike Brewer on the Discovery UK stage, Discovery Channel stage, to effectively kind of launch our show, I guess. We are talking about it publicly for the first time really, so that's going to be quite exciting. Got a few interviews lined up and a few things on stage alongside Mike, but I'm also quite looking forward to just looking around the show. Whilst I'm doing it though, I'm going to try and answer as many of your questions as I possibly can. Welcome to another Ask Elvis. Right, let's crack on with some questions. I'm going to start with this one from Sucker Me Off. It's not often I get to say that here on YouTube. He says, a lot of talk with Lewis winning his 6th world title about his greatness. How do you rate him amongst the other greats? Also, which car was harder to drive? The current Merc era or Senna's McLaren era? Manual gears, driver aids, aero, etc. considered. Right, so good question. It's a question that I've been asked a lot, particularly over the last week or so since Lewis won his title. It's obviously impossible to compare drivers directly because they compete in such different eras, and the challenge of a Formula 1 driver is completely different during the different eras of Formula 1. So their job description, if you like, becomes completely different. The task of driving a car, the task of being a Formula 1 driver is completely changed in between the various eras of the sport. So you can't compare the two. I would say that Lewis has to be up there amongst the greats just because of what he's achieved and what he continues to achieve through different eras of the sport himself. Different generations of the sport. One sec.
That's fine, mate. Thank you.
There's lots of different rule changes, lots of different types of Formula 1 car that Lewis has been successful in, and yeah, you can always lay things at his door about him always being in a fast car, in a highly competitive car, and that's absolutely true. Well, look, the cream rises to the top. Lewis is driving the best cars because he's one of the best drivers, and Formula 1 in its modern format means that if you're not in one of the best cars, you are not going to win championships. So it's not as easy to say, look, put him in a Williams and see what he can do, because the Williams car will simply not do the job. So I would say he's got to be up there, one of the greats, if not the all-time great, but it's just so difficult to compare them all, as I say. In terms of how the cars are easy or hard to drive, I also don't really buy that that's a consideration. I know that lots of the traditionalists will be screaming at your screen saying, of course they were harder to drive in the old days. They didn't have all the driver aids that we have now that make life much easier. Yeah, in a physical sense, it's a bit like that. In a physical sense, perhaps the cars were much more physical to drive back then, but that doesn't necessarily equate to being harder. As I touched on a moment ago, the job of a Formula 1 driver has changed completely. So now driving the cars, you've got to be a lot more technical. You've got to have a much more technical understanding of the way the cars operate. You've got to be able to kind of cope with loads of different things as well as just driving the car, changing settings, understanding what some of those settings do, when to be able to use them. You've got to perhaps be slightly more thoughtful as a Formula 1 driver, as opposed to just having brute raw speed, which might have been the key to some success in the old days. So I'm sorry I can't give you a proper answer, but I think the answer is that you can't really compare cars or drivers from different eras in terms of their various achievements. I think we've just got to look at each one as it comes and look at and recognise the success that they're having, and you can't look at Lewis Hamilton and say anything other than he's had incredible levels of success. Hats off to him. Right, next question from Rob Booth, who says, I've seen a lot of people say that Lewis doesn't get the recognition he deserves in the UK for his accomplishments. Do you think this is mainly down to F1 not being on free-to-air TV? I think it was 2012 onwards when it stopped. Rob, I 100% think that has a massive part to play in it. How can the world at large know about Lewis Hamilton's achievements if they can't see it? It doesn't even make mainstream news half the time in the UK, which is such a shame. because it used to be such a big part of you know, every household, or lots of households around the UK when it was on mainstream free-to-air telly. So yes, it's a huge problem with the sport today, particularly in the UK, where it has such a massive fan base, and yet nowadays people are drifting away from it because it has to take a significant effort and a significant financial investment to be able to watch it. So yes, that's a big part of why Lewis doesn't get the recognition around this country that he so richly deserves. Right, while we're on the subject of Lewis Hamilton, Distilled London UK says, "Hi Mark, now that Lewis has wrapped up the title, do you think Mercedes will put Esteban Ocon into the car for the last 2 Grand Prix?" No, absolutely not, for 2 reasons. First of all, Esteban has signed for Renault for next year, so the last thing they want to give him is any more experience of the current Mercedes car that he might then be able to take that knowledge with him to Renault. And secondly, you know, they still want to continue to develop this current car, because whatever they develop on this year's car carries over to next year. Lewis is the best placed person to do that, and they still want to absolutely dominate the last 2 races. Make no mistake, they will not be giving up in the last 2 Grand Prix of this season. You bet your bottom dollar on that. There are still things with the current Mercedes car that are not perfect. They've got weaknesses, and they will want to address those, because don't forget, this is these next 2 Grand Prix become a major test session really for Mercedes and everybody else who's no longer fighting for championship position, because it's the last real opportunity to drive the car in anger before we get to pre-season testing. So it's valuable lap time, valuable track time rather, that these teams, particularly now that the position that Mercedes are now in, they just cannot afford to waste. So having their 2 race drivers who know the car best will certainly be best placed to develop that car over the next 2 Grand Prix. Over there is a guy that some of you will recognise, because if you followed my channel for a while, you'll know that we've given away quite a bit of his artwork already. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Joel Clark.
I think I recognise that voice, do I not, Mark? Hello.
How are you, mate?
Very nice to meet you, Mark.
Good to see you.
Well,
you're creating something pretty special here, aren't you?
We are attempting the Ford GT40 interior.
This is a nod to the movie.
Nod to the movie called Ford versus Ferrari.
So you're creating this over the course of the weekend here at the show, and hopefully by the end of today it's finished?
The bulk, there's finer details, which really I sort of need to be back in the studio, and, like proper lighting and finish off. But really, I mean, I came here and I got about the seat done and 1 or 2 dials. Yeah. But we're it'll be just about there. It's looking great, and I look forward to seeing the end results. And I mean, I've got to rush off, but I just wanted to say, on behalf of probably everybody watching this channel, thank you so much for donating so many pieces to the competitions this year. Absolute pleasure.
They've been so well received. I hope you've read all the comments, because they're so lovely from these guys, and it tells you how much they appreciate what you're doing.
Well, it makes it all the worthwhile for me, because you know, you're sat at home in the studio by yourself all day, and honestly, to have people's comments and likes and retweets and so on, it makes the world for me, because it just makes it worthwhile, and I just know that people like what I'm doing. Well, basically,
keep doing what you're doing, because we love it too. If you haven't yet, I'm sure most of you have, but if you haven't yet, go and check out Joel's site on the gpbox.com. I will make sure that I put a link to that in the description of this video. It's got loads of awesome stuff, so check it out, and if you fancy getting yourself a little cheeky Christmas present, you know where to go. Right, Joel, have a great day. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon.
Pleasure, Mark.
Ta-ra.
Cheers, see you.
Well, what a nice guy. If I do win the lottery, by the way, I'll take either of those 2. Dave Pan Rios asked this one. He says, with the 2021 F1 cars adding a winglet over their front wheel, how much of an impact will this have on the high-speed tyre changes in F1 pit stops? It will have an impact, but I actually don't think it's going to be as significant as people think, because what Formula 1 teams are very good at is adapting to this kind of thing. So they'll just slightly change their technique, they'll slightly change their positioning, but actually I think very quickly we'll be very close to the speeds we're at right now. That is a monster of a car, the M8 competition. I was very lucky to take that around the Lausitz ring in Germany and rag it around for a few laps with Timo Glock alongside me, which was an awful lot of fun. So that's a raw, loud, noisy, arrogant monster of a car. Original car from the Sweeney TV show. Right, we've got loads of questions on 2021, unsurprisingly, because of the announcement last weekend. And this one from Nishant F1. He says, for 2021, don't you think the budget cap should be in place from next year onwards? Otherwise, team would spend tons of money next year ahead of 2021, and eventually we'll have status quo. Absolutely, and actually you're not the only person to say that. Lots of the teams have been saying that. Red Bull, Christian Horner has been very vocal on that, and yes, it makes a lot of sense. What Red Bull was suggesting actually was that we delay the introduction of the technical rule changes until 2022 to allow us to have a year of the new financial regulations in place, so that by the time we get to launching and developing the new cars, everybody's on this much closer or more level financial platform. What we're going to have in reality next year is everybody spending as big as they possibly can, probably going way above and beyond their means to try and put investment in before the regulations come, the financial regulations come into play. So teams are going to be investing in things like wind tunnels and equipment and systems that can simulation tooling and that kind of thing. So some of the really, really big and expensive investments, if you can get those done before the regs come into play in January 2021, they're then free of those restrictions. So you can then use those as much as you want throughout 2021 without that impacting on your financial expenditure. So yes, it kind of is going to make a slight mockery of it, because only the big teams are going to be able to make those kind of big investments that can really play a part in how their 2021 season with these new regulations really shapes up. We've also got, of course, the whole of next year where the development of those cars is going to be taking place, and in that sense you can put loads more people, loads more resource onto it, because there's no restriction in that phase up until a couple of months before the cars hit the racetrack. So yes, you're absolutely right, it's one of those things that's a bit of an afterthought, but what we should have done is staged it so the financial regs come into play first, and then perhaps a year later the new technical and sporting regs come into play. But we haven't done it. It's the way it is. It's going to play out as it now looks, and we are going to have the bigger teams having the biggest advantage and being able to spend almost what they want in the build-up to the season. Shame, really. Vahu86 says, do you think we're going to see other tyre manufacturers rejoining F1 again, i.e. tyre wars, or are they keeping F1 a one manufacturer venture? For the short term and foreseeable future, it will be just a one manufacturer operation, and for the moment that's Pirelli, and for the next few years in fact that's Pirelli. There's a number of reasons for that. Pirelli have invested heavily in the 2021 regulations. They've been crucial in shaping those regulations as to what looks best for the sport, how they think that the regulations should have been developed, the direction that they've gone in. So they have put an awful lot into Formula 1, but also, of course, we're in this phase of Formula 1 now where we've got to start reducing costs. And as with everything, if you start making it a competitive market and putting other manufacturers in there competing against each other, the costs inevitably go up, because they have to constantly be developing those tyres at a much faster rate. we had it in the past, haven't we? And I well know that the costs of that type of exercise just spiral out of control very rapidly, because performance and winning is everything in Formula One. So you will spend whatever it takes if you think there's an opportunity to gain an advantage from it.
I'm working on another series here in the UK. I've got a new mechanic. He's called Mark F1 Elvis, believe it or not. His name is Elvis. Mark is a Formula One mechanic. He worked with Lewis Hamilton. He was his race engineer at Mclaren. Mark is now working with me on this new series, and I'm going to be introducing him to you, to the world, here on the stage in about an hour's time. I'm going to be heading over to Maguire's, the club showcase.
So, there you go. I'll be joining Mike in about an hour from now to talk about the new show. I'm effectively being introduced, I guess, to the Discovery audience, or at least those who are here for the show, which I'm really looking forward to, because I'm really excited about the show. It's so far from my normal comfort zone, something so different to what I normally do. But filming's been so much fun, and I think it'll end up being a really nice show, so can't wait for you guys to see it. So Van Archie asks this one. He says, how do teams set up a car for publicity events, i.e. small city spaces, doing donuts, burnouts, etc.? How much are the engine revs restricted? How do they use the KERS battery? Which suspension setup's used? Which instructions are given to the drivers? Well, let's start with that. I can tell you what instructions are given to the drivers. Don't crash it. Some of these street events are in actually really tight, confined spaces, and they're being asked to put on a show for the crowd, and drivers can get pretty carried away. So do not crash it is the biggest instruction, the last instruction they ever get before they leave. So that's that one. In terms of the way that they set the cars up, it's actually a pretty basic car, so suspension systems will not be the most advanced. They're not going to be using some of these really trick hydraulic systems that you see on the current cars. It's typically the kind of systems that have the most spares available, so probably something from an early part of development from that car, perhaps from the car's typically a few years old, so it's whatever they've got kicking around on the shelf to some degree that obviously looks pretty standard. They will raise the ride heights up enormously, because these circuits or these areas that they're driving on typically are lumpy and bumpy streets, so they jack the ride height right up, make it as compliant as they can, probably soften the springs, soften the roll bars, dampers, just to cope with the life over a normal street, a normal road, as opposed to life on a racetrack where it's more comfortable. Engines will be dialed down, so yes, they won't be anywhere near the absolute rev limit, but essentially everything's geared up. It'll have all the toys on it to be able to allow a driver to put on this demonstration where he can do his burnouts, but also where the car's as easy to drive as it possibly can be. The last thing you want is a car that's on the limit, where the driver's, where it's getting skittish over bumps, that kind of thing. Because you just risk, you're just putting the guys, the car, the drivers, the fans at risk, and that's the last thing you want to do. You want to put on a show, but you want the car to come back safely at the end of it. Total Wankle, another great Twitter name. Total Wankle says, do customer teams get the same fuel and lubricants as the manufacturers? And if so, would this be a performance differentiator? So the answer is, at the moment they don't have to. Some do, but some don't. Some do their own commercial deals with manufacturers and use their own. And can it be a performance differentiator? Absolutely it can. We have some teams and manufacturers particularly who have a really strong tie-in and detailed links with their manufacturers, because they develop the fuels to suit the specifics of the engine, of the power unit. So if you're a customer using let's say Mclaren using a Renault engine, but you're using a different fuel and lubricant supplier to the manufacturer, i.e. Renault, which they are, by the way, yes, it can have a big impact. They will obviously make sure that it doesn't have too big an impact, but it can have an impact. And on that subject, we've got another one, because of course, speaking of McLaren's fuel and lubricant supplier, they have just lost the deal with Petrobras, and Keith Lamb says, hi Mark, will McLaren still be able to use Petrobras oil in their cars for the remainder of the season, or what happens now? Love the show. Thanks, Keith. Well, what happens now? Yes, they can, so there's no restrictions other than commercial restrictions, so every team's free to use whichever oil and fuel supplier they want. Most of them will try and link that into a commercial deal like McLaren did, but now that deal's gone, it makes perfect sense for them just to continue. Look, we've got 2 races left. Continue with the same one, until the end of the season, and perhaps they just won't shout about it. They'll take the stickers off the rear wing, but it'll still be in the car because it makes no sense to change and do all the development that would entail at this late stage. Right, a question from Subrab, who says, hey Mark, can they run races on circuits such as Sochi in the opposite direction, i.e. anti-clockwise instead of clockwise, to spice up the races? Are there any rules banning this? There are no rules banning it as such, other than the fact that you can't do it because the circuits are designed a certain way round because of where the runoff areas are, where the marshals posts are, where all the safety features of that circuit are. The corners are laid out in a certain way because the cars are going a certain direction. So it's definitely not as simple as just switching it around the opposite way. There are some circuits where it may well be able to work, but it would take an awful lot of preparation, an awful lot of work behind the scenes to make that happen. Right, I've actually wandered in, but backstage, so just behind that big stage there, this is the Discovery stage, Discovery Channel stage, and look over there. That's Mike Brewer. So Mike's been hosting this massive Discovery stage all weekend. Let's go and say hello quickly. Hello mate, there he is.
Hello everyone out there, you're right.
How busy you've been hosting this all weekend.
It's knocked out, yeah, knocked out busy. I'm about to go on stage one more time, this time with a Goblin Works carriage, get some stuff away, get the audience built up.
And then me and you are up together.
It's in preparation all for you. That's what I'm doing.
I'll see you very shortly.
All right mate, no worries.
Yeah, so what an amazing event this is, and there's all of the stars of the Discovery Channel's collection of car shows that are here this weekend. So if you are a fan of the channel and a fan of the type of car shows that Discovery plays, I mean, this is the perfect event, because on that stage right there, all weekend, all of the stars of those shows are up there. They're rebuilding cars, restoring cars, talking about the cars on their shows, which is obviously exactly what we're about to go and do together. But it has been a real eye-opener. It's the first time I've ever been to this place, this event, but I absolutely love it so far. It's great, and it's huge. Over there, right over there in the corner, they're actually restoring a car right now as we speak. They started it at the beginning of the weekend, they keep taking it out for an update, and at the end of today they're hoping to show the finished article. Sort of want to go and give them a hand, but I mean, not really. This question from Critic Citizen says, hey Mark, I'd like to hear your opinion on the effectiveness of the 2021 rear wings and an explanation why their sides are so different from the current ones. Will the FIA raise them up further again if they don't achieve their target? Okay, so the effectiveness is definitely far less than the effectiveness of the current Formula 1 rear wings, but that's very deliberate. A lot of the aerodynamic downforce is now going to come, as many of you will know this by now, much of the downforce effect will come from the underside of the car. So the ground effect phenomenon of the air passing underneath the car will generate a much larger percentage of the car's overall downforce, which means we're much less reliant on the wings. That's the first thing. So they're definitely less effective, but that's by design. The reason the sides are kind of curved and it's almost one piece, isn't it, without edges, is because each of those edges, where the main plane meets an end plate, for example, at the end of an end plate, they all create vortices, spinning pockets of air, which can be useful in terms of energizing the airflow, sending the airflow to where you want it to go. They're used all over the car for that very reason. But one of the downsides of it, particularly at the rear wing, is that it creates massive vortices which then create this huge pocket of turbulence behind the car that is one of the things that has an impact on the following car being able to follow closely without losing its downforce. So by making these rear wings one piece and have these very smooth curved designs, you minimise the power of that vortex that comes off each of those surfaces. Again, very deliberate and part of the strategy to minimise the turbulent effects coming off the back. So it's all there very deliberately. I don't think we're going to see rear wings getting bigger if they don't have an effect, because it's not really the effects, you know, we're not looking for a massive amount of downforce from them in the first place. Most of the development, aerodynamic development, will start to come from the underside of the car as we move forward through 2021. Might go and see how they're getting on. So I've just found myself backstage now, in the kind of I guess, the green room, which is where the snacks and the coffee is, so I'm quite happy here. But I just want to quickly pick up on that question that we had earlier about fuels and lubricants. I realised I didn't really explain why it could be a differentiator. So just quickly, I mean, obviously fuel, for the obvious reasons, fuel can affect performance. So how much power can you extract out of that quantity of fuel? But you know, the reason it has to be designed in with the engine is because it affects things like the way the fuel burns, or the combustion mixture burns across the combustion in the combustion zone inside the engine itself. It burns in different ways. Some are fast burning, some are slow burning, some are, you know, it has to be a controlled burn. So how does that spark front, the flame front, how does that dissipate across the mixture? Those kind of things are details that the fuel suppliers work very closely with their engine suppliers to work out the best way that their fuel can interact with the mechanical setup, the hardware that's in the engine. So, you know, where does the flame front start? Where is this? Do they have this kind of compression ignition type system? So, you know, there's so many different ways of making that work, and yet they have to be interlinked with each other. The conversation has to be had between the fuel supplier and the power unit supplier to get the very best. We're talking about tiny margins, but that's what wins and loses Formula One. Oils, similarly, you know, depending on the clearances that you might have in the mechanical setup of your engine, you need a certain type of oil. What kind of temperatures are you going to be running at? What kind of viscosity can really start to impact on the performance of your engine? How do you trade that off against what lubrication capabilities your oils might provide? So they're all sort of questions where you're talking about the tiniest little bit, but those tiny bits can actually be the difference between it, you know, being successful or not. And if you come in as a separate, you know, a team running a different engine, for example, or rather the same engine with a different fuel supplier, there's no guarantee that you'll get exactly the same performance benefits from that engine than you would do with the company that's worked closely in the design and manufacture. So it can make a difference. Only a small one, but it genuinely can make a difference.
We're on. There you go. Mark, you bought a +1 today, I believe. I have bought a +1. You would have seen Willie Venus there with my co-host Ant Anstead, who is currently in America preparing cars to fly back in a week's time. But I've been in the UK making a new series, and I've got a new UK mechanic, and I'm very excited to introduce him to the world because this is his first experience of doing a classic car show with me on stage, and he's going to get to know you lot very personally over the next few years. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for my new co-presenter on my new series. This is Mark Elvis Priestley.